welcome to our SAR panel session hosted by BDO in conjunction with the National Crime Agency. I will introduce myself properly as well as our panel members, but before we kick off, I'll just do a very quick recap about the session itself, as well as sharing a couple of housekeeping notices. Next slide, please, Caroline. Brilliant. So this session is aimed at nominated officers, MLROs, heads of financial crime, or anybody else who has a particular interest in SAR filing and financial crime. The intention is for it to be sector agnostic. So we're really delighted to be welcoming a wide audience today, and we really hope that you find the session useful. Appreciate that this session is on Zoom rather than in person, so for the duration of the session we will be keeping you as participants on mute and only our panel presenters will be speaking. The session will be recorded just for your awareness. However, to make the session a bit more interactive for everybody who's joined today, we will be polling you throughout the session. So please do contribute when you see the pop-ups on your Zoom screen. There's going to be quite a few throughout. Your responses will be entirely anonymous, and the polls are just to steer the direction of the conversation, so nothing's intended to trick you out. In terms of those polls and how they'll work, we'll be asking a couple of questions up front to ask about the sector you work in and how you're feeling today about your SAR framework and sort of SAR knowledge level. We'll then be posing 4 more poll questions, which we'll be asking to you guys, but we'll be using those to initiate our panel discussion. And then at the end, we just have one final poll question to ask about whether you'd be happy for us to contact you after today's session. Final notice from me is around the Q&A function on Zoom. So this is in use, and please do feel free to post questions to that. We won't be actively monitoring it throughout this session, as we're really cognizant that some questions being asked up front might be answered by our panel as we go through this session. However, if there's anything that we don't pick up by the end that hasn't been covered in the session, we will follow up on it afterwards. So please do feel free to use that Q&A box, and we will make sure that we've got everything covered either verbally today or as follow-up. So without further ado, I'd like to move on to the next slide and introduce you to our panel. So I'll kick off with myself and then stop speaking for a second. So my name is Clorinda, and it's my pleasure to host this panel event today. I'm an Associate Director in BDO's Economic Crime Advisory Practice. Typically, I support clients on a really wide range of issues outside of the banking and financial services space, with a whole host of different economic crime challenges. I predominantly work in AML, CTF and sanctions, but have had exposure to bribery and corruption, fraud, market abuse, etc. In terms of my time at BDO, I've been here for just over 2 years, and prior to that, I've held similar consultancy roles at a large law firm and also a Big 4 audit firm. I'll pass over now to EJ to introduce herself.
Thanks, Clorinda. Hi, everybody. My name is Emma Jane Turner, or you can just call me EJ, everybody does. So I am the Reporter Engagement Manager at the UK FIU as part of the National Crime Agency. So the Reporter Engagement team is one of 4 teams that sits under the UK FIU's engagement function. And our role is to engage with reporters and regulators and supervisors from across all of the regulated sectors to improve the quality of SARS reporting. My personal background, I was a financial services lawyer in New Zealand. I specialised in corporate finance and insolvency, bank compliance and regulation, and payment system regulation. I'm also a qualified teacher, and I've worked in the charity sector developing and delivering financial education, professional development programs and resources. I am about to, hopefully, complete my Masters in Economic Crime and Intelligence through the Centre of Criminal Justice Studies at the University of Portsmouth, and I joined the UK FIU back in February of this year.
Brilliant, thank you, EJ. Will, can I pass over to you to introduce yourself, please?
Thank you, Clorinda, and good morning, everyone. So I'm Will. I have worked at BDO for just under 2 years. I focus primarily on financial services clients, but that has ranged from payment services firms, large banks, branches and subsidiaries of overseas banks, and also recently some fraud risk management that has overlapped into SAR reporting. Prior to that, I was with the FCA, working in a specific financial crime role. I had some input into the SARS reform programme. And I think of more significance for today as well as I did spend 8 years in the National Crime Agency and what was the Serious Organised Crime Agency as a financial investigator. So as an end user of SARS as an intelligence source on a daily basis. And lastly, I was seconded to the UK Financial Intelligence Unit back in 2011, so I think a lot has changed, but I do have direct experience of working in that function.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Will. And last but certainly not least, Angela, please can you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Angela Foyle, and I've been at BDO for nearly 20 years, so quite a long time, initially as a tax partner, and then was transferred in to be the MLRO of the UK firm. I'm currently Head of Risk Management and Economic Crime at BDO Global, which is the network coordinating office. In terms of economic crime, I did a postgraduate diploma in economic crime, and I also have previously been the chair of the ICAW's Economic Crime Subcommittee. That's now been passed on to another really able colleague. I have been a member of the Suspicious Activity Reporting Strategic Reform Board, which is a public-private group with the Home Office, NCA, other public bodies, and the regulated sector, which has been looking at the SAR program in its entirety for probably around the last 5 years. So that's my background and my interest in this subject.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Angela. So throughout the session, I'll be turning to the panel to ask for their thoughts and insights on various topics. But just to kick off the session in terms of our attendees, we'd love to find out a little bit more about you. So the next 3 questions, you're going to see 3 poll questions just to gain a bit of an understanding about who we've got on this event today, what sector you work in, etc. So we'll switch over to our first poll question, and you should see a pop-up on your screen in a second, which is asking the question, which sector do you work in? We've not listed every sector that exists in the UK economy, but in a second when the pop-up opens, please can you select the answer that most closely reflects the sector that you're from. Great, so I'm seeing we've got a really varied audience today, which is fantastic. There's definitely a slight majority towards financial services, but a good spread across e-money and payments, legal, betting, gaming, real estate, art market, and other. And I know that other bucket is probably quite broad. So we're really pleased to welcome such a variety of people. And as I mentioned, the session is intended to be sector agnostic, but I and our panelists will keep in mind the different sectors that we've got present today while we're discussing our topics shortly. Moving on to our second question to understand a little bit more about you. So skipping to the next slide, how robust at a very high level do you think that your SAR framework is at the moment? You've got a couple of options there, so feel free to bring up the poll, please. Brilliant. So we've again got quite a diverse range of answers. It's really positive to see that a lot of responses are saying very robust or quite robust, but there's definitely a few different answers as well. So hopefully this session will be beneficial all around in terms of if you feel you've got a very robust SAR framework, that's fantastic. Hopefully this session will complement your knowledge and skill set already. For those of you where you feel there's a room for improvement, hopefully this session will fill some of those gaps for you. And then finally, the final poll from us, just to gain a bit of an understanding of why you're here. Which part of the SAR process do you find most challenging? We've got 5 answers here. There may be something else that you find most challenging, but out of the 5 options here, which of these do you find particularly concerning within your organisation? Can I launch the poll, please? Again, pretty even spread. The majority of individuals on this call are citing that training and awareness of non-specialist colleagues is a particular pain point, but very closely followed by being able to articulate suspicion in your suspicious activity reports and actually identifying red flags and potentially suspicious activity prior to doing that. So the good news is we will be covering on all of these topics today. So regardless of which answer you selected, hopefully we'll be able to provide some thoughts and insights on all of those. So that's brilliant to hear for the start of the session. Now for the fun parts. Next slide, please. So we will be now asking you 4 more poll questions, but one at a time. And these initially will be posed to the audience, but these will be to inform our panel discussion. And this is where I'd like to invite our panel members to speak on some insights and share some of their thoughts. So 4 of these in total, all focused on different aspects of the SAR framework. So can we start with the first panel question, please? So for our audience, first of all, and this links to what we were just talking about in the previous question, how confident are you that your staff are able to differentiate between what might constitute normal behaviour versus activity which may be suspicious? And there's 4 different answer options there. Please could you select one and we can launch the poll now. An interesting response rate. There's definitely a few people who have responded that they're very confident, which is absolutely fantastic. But by far the majority are indicating that they're moderately confident or slightly confident in this area. It's a really challenging one that we see as well in terms of actually defining suspicion and understanding red flags. So on that note, perhaps I can turn to Angela, given her ex-MLRO hat, and see if she's got any views on that differentiation point.
Well, I mean, as everybody who is attending will know, the bar for suspicion is incredibly low. I think the only real judicial expertise we've had on it is that it's more than speculation, but it doesn't require absolute knowledge, certainty, or anything else. It is a suspicion there. So I think in terms of the confidence, we've mentioned some of the things, and it will differ slightly. Things will differ between different types of businesses. But I think the first question that you have to ask yourself is, do you and your staff understand the baseline, as in what in your area is normal? And this will vary from different organizations. So if you're in the financial services sector, and I noticed there was something 56%, I think, of people are, this might be something through transaction monitoring. So what does the customer normally do? Does this seem in line with that? Is it so, is it merely unusual and the explanation makes sense? Or is it something that's beyond that? And I think it's trying to work that out. And I'm going to come on a little bit in a minute about things like red flags. For professional services, it may be more challenging. And actually, because there isn't the same degree of transaction flow going through, it's actually around what did you understand about your client, both from the work you've been doing for them and from the information you gathered in your KYC processes. Does this make sense for this business? Does it link into what you would expect businesses of this type to do? So there is that element of, have I got a baseline of what I think normal is, and do my staff understand, or do the staff understand what that baseline is and why it's so important to determine that baseline? And I think the second thing is actually, is there an understanding of what red flags in this area might look like, and have those been disseminated amongst the staff? And I noticed that there was some comment in one of the early ones about the red flags, that they weren't, not everybody's 100% confident about identifying red flags, but there is information out there, both from the NCA through some of their the documents come through, and I think we'll discuss those kind of feedback mechanisms in the future, but certainly the typologies and things that have been issued, making sure that those are disseminated through. Using, one of the things that we found quite powerful was going around teams and actually giving examples of the kind of things that had been picked up and why it was unusual and why it was different. So I think it's, none of this is rocket science, but it is actually, can I establish my baseline? Have I, do I disseminate information on what might potentially be a red flag? And, sort of also being open to questions. No question is too stupid, really. So if somebody from the rest of the firm comes in and asks, saying, look, we've seen this, we don't really understand it, dealing with that, getting them to talk through why, and could be very helpful, and it may actually help some of the further steps with the SAR as well. And with that, I'm sure others have got comments.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful point in terms of being inquisitive, and also the point that you made about understanding what your benchmark, what your starting point is. Will, I was hoping I could bring you in on this point as well, in terms of perhaps sharing some experience that you might have had working with our clients at BDO, but also drawing some experience that you've had in your previous roles. I wonder if you can comment a bit further.
Thanks, Clarenda. And Angela, that was a great piece of input. I think I would take a bit further some of the things you were saying. I think in terms of our client-facing work, certainly I think in terms of staff differentiating rather than nominated officers or specialists, I think what we would often find are things like generic training that doesn't address that point. I think Angela's may hear about. I think you might have something that talks about the framework generally, some examples, but I think first line of defense or customer facing staff come away from that on their 1 day's training and then think, how does that apply to me? And I think the firms where we've seen better practice and ultimately higher quality internal SARs and understanding are those where specialists have been able to apply their knowledge and educate those first line of defense staff about, this is the high level concept and this is how it might apply with our particular product, services, delivery channels and so on. So I think that's one point. I think it obviously the larger financial services firms and transaction monitoring are slightly different points. They're meant to flag normal behavior versus activity that might be suspicious. That's still difficult, but I think what we were just saying still applies. I think without that baseline understanding for that is set initially and is there perhaps as an open line of communication between the first line and the second line of defense, I think that's where hopefully the confidence levels will grow. So sometimes I just kind of finish on this point because I think it's a good, internal SARs are such good indicators of an answer to this question. Sometimes I think that, again, when we see frameworks working well, we're seeing nominated officers and MROs looking at trends in internal SARs that people are trying, they're not quite getting the answers right, but then that hints at a kind of a training need in a particular sector of the organization, for example, that is picked up. I think the weaker frameworks don't tend to make those connections properly. And I'll pass on to someone else. Thank you.
Thanks, Will. And yeah, very much agree with you. There was a point in there that you made about making sure that training and awareness is specific to the particular institution, its risks, its customer base. And I definitely echo that in sectors outside of financial services. It's really important to stay on top of those typologies, be adapting to new trends. Unfortunately, criminals are constantly trying to be one step ahead and more savvy and finding new and innovative ways to cheat the system and circumvent controls. So for me, it's around being agile but also clearly articulating what risk and what red flags mean in the context of the particular institution at hand, whether that be a financial services institution or whether that be a casino platform or whether that be an art platform. Very different risks and very different typologies that exist within those. I'd also like to bring EJ in on this point if possible, please, possibly from a different perspective in terms of handling of those SARs once they've been submitted to the NCA, and the importance of being able to identify red flags and differentiate between a customer's normal behaviour versus things that might constitute a suspicious. EJ, I wonder if you have any thoughts to add from an NCA perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously from a UK FIU perspective, we cannot and do not advise reporters on whether something is suspicious or how to decide whether that activity is suspicious, because you as reporters are best placed to do that using all of the kind of systems and processes that have already been mentioned. However, once you have determined that there is a suspicion and that you need to submit a SAR to us, we ask that you really carefully consider how you're going to explain that reason for suspicion to us in your SAR. Remembering that we do not have all of the same information or history with the subject that you do. So you need to really clearly explain to us exactly what has led you to be suspicious in this particular case. For example, simply saying that their behavior is different to normal is not enough. How is it different? What was the normal and how has it changed? If your suspicion is based on the fact that the activity or transaction differs from normal behavior, tell us why. Give us that information. We can't guess or imply details into the information you provide, so you should always ensure you include things like the who, what, when, why, and how. And if there's that's all covered off in your SAR, that's really helpful to us. And just thinking kind of outside of financial services specifically, if your activity or the transaction relates to a service you provide or a particularly technical aspect of your work, it really helps us if you provide an explanation of that service or technical aspect. It really helps the officers reading the SARs to understand your suspicion better. As you can imagine, our officers cannot be experts in every kind of transaction or arrangement that is seen across all of the different sectors and all of the different SARs that we receive. So just really clear and concise explanations for us are really helpful.
Thanks, EJ. That was some really useful insights and probably segues quite nicely into the next question that we're going to ask, given that the changes in the summary box and the narrative that can be written with SARs is something that's changing as the UK rolls out its new SAR reporting platform. So with that in mind, can we move across to the next question, please? So as I just mentioned, hopefully most on this call are aware, but for those who aren't, as part of the UK SAR reform, the SAR reporting portal is in the process of being upgraded. It is currently being rolled out, and I'm sure Angela will be able to provide much more detail than I will shortly on this, given her roles in the SAR reform. It's currently being rolled out to some of the larger institutions within the UK, so please don't be concerned if you've not seen it yet. However, hopefully you're aware of some of the key differences that are going to be introduced by this new platform, one of them being much more similarity to government gateway platforms that you might be familiar with, and requesting very specific data points during the SAR filing process about predicate offences and about specific red flags, risks and typologies that you're articulating in your SAR. So against that backdrop, we'd like to understand from your perspective as the audience, how do you think the new portal will change SAR making SAR submissions? Do you think it'll make it easier, harder, or not really a change? And can we launch that poll, please? Well, I'm sure EJ will be very happy, given her role, to see that the majority of you, almost 2/3, have answered that they think that the new SAR portal will make submissions easier, which is fantastic news. A much smaller proportion have said harder, and around 1/4 of respondents have said no change. So I'm sure that is a very positive takeaway and music to EJ's ears. In terms of some of the benefits of the new platform, EJ, can I pass over to you to share some of those and to give your perspectives from the UK FIU?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, that's very great to see. Very happy with that. I am conscious that a lot of people listening to this webinar may not have seen the portal or heard much about it either. So just a really quick overview of the rollout that Clarinda mentioned. So we are currently in the beta phases of the rollout, where reporters are being invited to sign up to the portal in cohorts, and those cohorts are kind of increasing rate and size going forward. So please, just to reiterate what Clarinda said, please don't worry if you haven't been invited yet. It's important that we stagger the rollout and onboarding of new reporters for kind of stress testing and resiliency purposes. But all reporters will be required to register for the new portal in time, and you can look on the NCA website for user guides and some overviews about that process and how the new portal will work. But please do not try and register until you have been invited. Some key things about the new portal, some of it's already been mentioned, but essentially it includes much more structured fields for information. I think it's over 180 of them if you're completing a full DAML SAR, for example. This means that as you work through the online form, you're asked specific questions about the information you might have. For example, account numbers, phone numbers, law enforcement interests, etc. So a lot of the information that you may be used to including only in the free text reason for suspicion section, there are now specific fields that this information needs to be included in. A really important example of this is the glossary codes. Hopefully you're all aware of glossary codes. These are really important from a UK FIU and law enforcement perspective, as they allow us to analyse trends, identify high-risk cases for development, and take immediate action if we need to. So in the current SAR online, we rely on reporters typing these correctly into the reason for suspicion field. But in the new portal, these are provided as a checkbox list. So reporters just need to tick the ones that apply. I'm really happy that on the whole, we feel that it's going to be easier. That's really great. I will be honest with you, completing a SAR on the new portal will at least initially probably take you longer than the current process does. It will take a bit of getting used to because it obviously has a lot more questions. But in the long run, it will make the whole SAR submission and exploitation process much more efficient. So these additional structured fields that we've added in mean that the final SAR that comes out the end of it provides much more structured intelligence for the UK FIU to use and the wider law enforcement to use, focused around those key pieces of information that law enforcement needs to fully exploit SAR's intelligence. The structure should also hopefully help us reduce how often we have to come back to reporters requesting further information before we can make a decision. Particularly in relation to DAML SARs, so Defence Against Money Laundering SARs, because this takes up really significant amounts of time and resource for us. Finally, and this has kind of already been mentioned a little bit as well, but the new SAR portal is just part of those much wider SARs reform program reforms, which has already delivered significant change and benefits, including increases in both the analytical and engagement capabilities of the UK FIU. And I think that many of the benefits from the new SAR portal will obviously not be realised straight away. There's still other parts of that SARS reform program to put into place. But along with all of those other changes, it will provide us with better capability to protect the public from serious and organised crime, which is ultimately why we're here.
Thanks, EJ. And it was really useful to have a bit of a high-level run-through of some of the key benefits and changes being introduced with the new portal. As you mentioned, this isn't going to be something that changes on Monday morning or next Monday morning, but it's definitely something that it's a positive step in the right direction in that fight against financial crime, which is really fantastic. Angela, I'd like to bring you in as well on this point. I'm sure, given your role both at BDO and probably in some of the other hats that you take, you've got some views on this point as well. I'd love to invite you to share your thoughts.
Yeah, Thank you. And I think EJ's gone through most of the key points on the online portal. It is, as you mentioned, very much like all of the government gateway sites, because that's the government standard. So if you've applied online for a passport or a driving license or anything else, you will see great similarities, which means that it facilitates easier use, particularly for people who perhaps not necessarily in financial services, but in some of the other areas are infrequent submitters of SARS. It's just more intuitive and it follows you down a track. And I think that's quite important. It is relatively lengthy because each page has one particular sort of thought or question or area to be answered. So it can feel like you're going through lots and lots of pages, whereas the previous one you might have had 5 questions on it. It is one concept per page. The big plus, and I think anybody who's been in my position at 8 o'clock at night where they're desperately trying to fill in that last bit of the 8,000 character suspicion and suddenly realize they haven't done anything to save it and lose everything, it saves each page. So you can go back and deal with it again, which I think I have to say is a huge benefit. I think the wider elements around this, the increase in the engagement team, which we've already seen some of the benefits of that in terms of the greater level of ability to engage with the FIU, the greater amount of material coming out of the FIU, and I think we're going to come on to discuss that, so I won't preempt the point at the end, but there is more material coming out of there. I think it is something that, you know, the greater analytical skills may not immediately be visible to users of the portal, but where it will come out is in things like, you know, better understanding of typologies and threats, which over time will start getting disseminated out to users, not necessarily in phase 1, but during sort of as a longer part. The other thing that has been part of this program is not just the portal, but looking at particular areas of challenges. So DAMLs in relation to return of funds to victims of fraud, for example, which was looked at and provisions were brought in to facilitate, make that easier. There's been significant discussions around aspects like fungibility, where you have 5,000 of a £15,000 pot being tainted, and that's been taken into the new economic crime corporate transparency bill if it goes through. So there have been other changes that have been part of the program, but I think in terms of the online portal, it may initially feel that it's slower and longer, but it is I think probably a more stable program. The only thing that I would say is that you are still in that element at the end where you have a set number of characters. I think it's the 8,000 characters to actually describe the reason for suspicion. But I think, as EJ said, because you've actually put in all the other information before, you can just be concise in that. I still have a slight question around how easy it would be within that 8,000 character limit to give both a reason for suspicion and explain a complex insolvency deal. But that might be something we have to finesse at a later stage.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, this new platform has obviously gone through considerable testing, and I'm sure some of the participants on this event today will have been party to that as well. I think overall, there's never going to be a perfect solution that's landed on our laps. However, some of the benefits that EJ pointed out and that Angela you've built upon will certainly make life a lot easier in certain circumstances. And I particularly picked up on that page saving piece. I'm sure any MLROs and nominated officers and their deputies that we've got on this call today will be very pleased to hear that additional functionality. I'm keen to, in the interest of time as well, move on to the next question, but also so that I can re-bring Will into the conversation as well. So moving on to the next question, please. And this is so just to inform our audience, this is a poll question, but rather than asking you to select one answer, we're going to ask you to select any and all that apply from the 5 options. So we'd love to gain a bit of an understanding around how, or if you gain assurance around your SAR process and ensuring that that's working as intended? Do you employ a compliance monitoring program, internal audits? Maybe you gain external assurance from a third party, or perhaps you do more ad hoc internal reviews. Conversely, you might be a relatively new institution and this isn't an area of your framework that you focused on yet, hence why you might be joining this webinar. So I'll throw this one out as a poll now to the audience. Please select all that apply, and then I'm sure our panel will have some views. Brilliant. As with the previous questions, a really wide range of answers, lots of people mentioning that they've got a formal compliance monitoring program in place, as well as pretty much 50% saying this is something that internal audit looks at, or ad hoc reviews. Probably just under a third saying you gain some sort of external assurance in relation to your SAR program. So that's really good to understand, and hopefully we can share some further insights about what we see at different institutions based on the work that we do. Will, can I throw this one out to you to start with, in terms of perhaps sharing some of your on the ground stories of where you see this working well, or perhaps not working so well?
Thank you, Corinda. And I think I will start I think about the strength of documentary framework, and I'll comment on kind of why I think that's important. But I think making sure that procedures are as detailed as possible, and I think Angela hinted at, and EJ were talking about that. For example, in your procedures, talking about the what, where, why, when, and how of articulating suspicion. Perhaps we've seen some good practice about trying to explain in the context of your own firm what the difference between unusual or suspicious might be. So I think that documentation is there to combine with training, to combine with other processes that are in place across the organisation. And I think having that more detailed framework is the first step in thinking, well, if people aren't still quite understanding that, it's probably something's not quite working. So I think that's the first step. I think we do see when firms, regardless of the sector, have a good compliance monitoring plan that is targeting risks based on previous gaps, whether that's training needs analysis, like I was talking about in terms of perhaps trends from internal SARs. Those SAR processes do tend to work better. I think the key is also, lastly, how do you know what your process is intended? And I think that goes back to Angela's point about baseline, and it also comes back to enterprise-wide risk assessment. You've got to know what the risks are, what those high inherent risks are, what the residual risks are, and that perhaps, I'll finally just say that certain things might be high risk, but they won't trigger many SARs. That doesn't mean your SAR process isn't working. It's just that you've identified a risk. It might be something you don't want to happen. The likelihood of it occurring is rare. If a SAR hasn't triggered, is that perhaps something that's working as intended? So I think it's all of those things. And that's the way to gain assurance. I think still making sure that your enterprise-wide risk assessment as an ongoing process is tied into the risks you would expect to see, and that you have a good idea of how you think it should work as intended. I don't think some firms that we assess actually do know the answer to that question.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Will, and I think I'd build on that as well from some of the clients I work with and the work that I do, and is that it's all very well establishing a robust SAR framework in isolation, but ultimately your SAR framework links to your wider AML control framework. So to expand on that slightly, you may have in place a very experienced money laundering reporting officer, you might have documented clear escalation channels, but actually if your customer due diligence and KYC processes are not functioning as intended, or you have poor tone from the top, just as examples, then actually your SAR mechanisms aren't likely to work in an effective manner. So for me, it's looking at SARs, or the SAR framework, as a framework in itself, but as a sort of one cog in a much wider AML framework, from a sort of assurance perspective. I know, Will, in the introduction that you gave there, it was really helpful that you linked back to what Angela mentioned before in terms of understanding your baseline. I wonder if, Angela, there's any further comment that you can make on that in terms of establishing what you expect your client to do, just to conclude this question.
Well, I think the point that I would, it's sort of the baseline is important, but actually part of that baseline, and I think Will mentioned it, was the enterprise-wide risk assessment. So there are a couple of things I think in terms of looking at things as intended. First is by your own monitoring processes. How good are the internal reports that I'm receiving? Does it show that there is an understanding? I think Will mentioned that earlier, because if you're getting poor quality internal reports where you have to go back and get a whole load of information and don't quite understand whether it's unusual, suspicious, and actually relatively few are then going on to external reporting, then that's an indication that there's a training need, that people aren't understanding, that the baseline perhaps isn't being set. So it's part of the monitoring process. The second is just looking at the areas of where suspicious activity reports may be coming in from in your business. Your enterprise-wide risk assessment should be indicating areas of risk. If there are particular outliers in any of those, is there a good reason for it? And I think Will's already sort of touched on that. Is there a good reason why I'm not receiving SARs from, this particular unit? Is it because actually they've got such good controls on KYC that actually you're not taking on the clients, or is it something else? So it's actually that comes back down to something that you mentioned, Clorinda, that inquisitive mindset, asking questions. Does this make sense? There is also, I think, in the regulations somewhere that there is an internal audit process required. And I realize over internal controls for the money laundering compliance framework anyway. So one would hope that internal audit might be someone that could help in this case. It's as proportionate, obviously. So if you're a very tiny business, you may not have that, but for those that do, this might be an area. So I think those are the three key points I would make is, what are you getting from your MI? Is this in line with what you're expecting? Are there areas that you have identified where you think actually this doesn't seem to be working? Where are the outliers?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for participating. Well, Will and Angela for participating there. And then finally, the fourth question to pose to our audience to spark panel discussion and bring EJ back into the fold. Thank you. Move on to the next slide. So finally, we mentioned this earlier, but in terms of NCA feedback, alerts, publications, things like SARS in action, we'd like to gain a view on how you feel that helps to improve your SAR process. So we're back to the previous structure of selecting one answer of the four, so significantly, moderately, slightly, or not at all. We'll give you a few seconds. Thank you for launching the poll. Again, hopefully music to EJ's ears that the majority of responses say significantly or moderately, with a few people saying slightly, and nobody has responded saying not at all. So I'm sure EJ will be very pleased about that response in particular. In terms of some of the NCA feedback that's available, and particularly some of the pieces that we've not mentioned on this particular question side, EJ, can I bring you back in to talk about some of those and how they can be used to benefit an organization's SAR framework?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, really positive to see, and obviously this kind of increase in engagement and guidance that we can put out is part of that wider SARS reform as well. So, but we are really aware that feedback for reporters on SARS is an area that's really important, and that's something people would like to see improved. So a couple of things to say on that. You might be aware that UK FIU receives over 900,000 SARs a year. So hopefully you can see that to provide feedback on all of them or to every individual reporter is just not practical, and in many cases not appropriate due to the nature of the investigations in which those SARs may be used. Something that's really important to remember is that SARs are made available for law enforcement to search for up to 6 years after submission. So even if your SAR is not immediately used in an investigation or immediately picked up, it may be picked up and provide vital intelligence down the line somewhere as well. But we are also aware, as I said, of how important feedback and engagement is. So as Clorinda said, I'm just going to make sure we're all aware of what kind of feedback and engagement opportunities are available. So the question here mentioned SARs in Action, which is the UK FIU's magazine. This is available on our website. You can also email us to join our mailing list to receive it directly, digitally into your inbox. So it's a great source of information for reporters, is where we publish articles about current threats, trends, red flags, as well as sanitized case studies of where SARs intelligence has assisted in preventing and detecting crime. We've had a recent fraud themed one, so we do sometimes theme them for particular sectors, and we've probably got some accountancy sector and legal sector specific ones coming up over the next few months, so do keep an eye out for those. We also produce regular reporter booklets. I think the most recent one was produced just a couple of weeks ago, and these contain sanitized summaries of feedback from law enforcement agencies on their use of SARs. Again, these are available to download on our website, and you can be added to the mailing list to receive them directly. So these are really useful because they're just a whole lot of different case studies, examples of how SARs have supported not just the detection of or investigation of financial crimes, but of the whole raft of crimes that are out there. And then finally, and Angela pointed to this before, our reporter engagement team, our entire remit is focused on working with reporters to improve SAR quality across the sectors. And we do this in a variety of ways. There is our written guidance that's currently out there. We are in the process of producing some video guidance, just short kind of 1 to 2 minute, up to 5 minute videos on specific areas of SARs best quality. So do keep an eye out for that. We are looking to do some sector specific versions as well, particularly focused initially on the accountancy and legal sectors, and then moving out to some of the other sectors as well. And then we as a team provide SARs best practice sessions and feedback sessions for reporters, and this might be an area that people are not quite so aware of. So we may contact you when we receive specific feedback on one or more of your SARs from either our NCA operational teams or wider law enforcement. So you might hear from us that way, but you can also reach out to us directly, and we can discuss with you how best we can support your organisation. This might be us coming to deliver a best practice workshop, which we can do. We can do presentations. We can also do a specific one-to-one feedback session where we look at a selection of your organisation SARs and we provide specific best practice feedback on those. So a bit of a plug for us as the reporter engagement team. Please do reach out. Clorinda will hopefully be able to share some contact details afterwards, but you can contact us on ukfiu.engagement@nca.gov.uk, and we'll see how we can help.
Thanks, EJ. It's really great to hear that there's sort of that two-way street, as it were, with the FIU, and I'm sure the participants of this call may have been aware of some of those mechanisms to engage with the NCA, but perhaps not all of them. So definitely been a useful overview from you. I'm conscious we've only got 10 minutes remaining, so I'll chip in on this point as well, and then move on to our final question. So, EJ, you mentioned about you receive 9,000 SARs per year. It's a high number, and I know working across some of the non-financial services sectors, there can be a tendency to sort of feel like, well, my SAR isn't that important. It's mainly the banks who file SARs. I don't maybe need to. I don't understand what use mine has. I think the message I definitely put out there is that your SAR could be that missing puzzle piece, as EJ mentioned, the collective information and insights and intelligence that is gained from various SARs filed across various sectors is really important. And obviously criminals work across all of these sectors. It's not like the criminals go, oh, today we're just going to target financial services. They have a sophisticated remit, and therefore we need to do that as well. And so your small SAR from your perspective might actually be the piece that unlocks a whole load of insight and intelligence, and can really be beneficial to teams like those that EJ works with. So please do take the lessons learned from banking and perhaps larger sectors, and do continue to submit SARs in all the instances that we've talked about today. So finally, moving on to our last section in the last couple of minutes of this session. This is a non-poll question, but I'd like to turn to each of the panelists and ask them to provide one key takeaway from this session, and about SARs that you'd like to share. And if I can ask this to be sort of a snappy soundbite, that would be fantastic. So Angela, I'll come to you first, please.
Okay, I mean, I think most of it I've already said, and I think it's two words really. First is baseline, and the second one is skepticism. The accountants, particularly auditors, are very familiar with skepticism, but it is that question of, really, does this make sense? Thinking about things in terms almost of, well, given everything else I know and given everything else I've seen, does this make sense? And have that skeptical mindset.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. Will, I'm going to turn to you next, please.
Thank you. And I think I would build on with that. And as reporters, I would say be confident. Articulating suspicion can be difficult, but there is guidance. But you can, if you can articulate it and defend it, I think as EJ said, you're in a good place. And I say that partly because, having seen thousands of SARs in the NCA, it's quite quick to see which ones had that vague feeling of unease, which would not suffice. I think in our versus De Silva versus somebody who'd confidently said, this is wrong because of this, is what, where, why, when, and how. You will never have the full picture, but the bar for suspicion is low. But have that confidence that you have the experience and capability of articulating that suspicion, and the confidence in doing so will come across in the quality of the SAR.
Thanks, Will. That's really helpful as well. EJ, can I come to you next?
Yeah, I would just reiterate a point that you've already made a little bit earlier about do not underestimate the importance of the intelligence your SAR can provide, even if you feel that it goes into the black hole of the UK FIU. It might provide, you might feel that the information that you're providing is a small piece or an insignificant piece of information, but it actually could be a really important piece in a much bigger puzzle. And for us, that it can be something that can really push forward an investigation. So please continue doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd conclude by saying that sort of no matter where you are and whichever sector you sit in, it's a sort of collective team effort, which hopefully echoes EJ's sentiments as well. Brilliant. Well, this draws us to the end of our session today. We hope that you found it helpful. We will be asking you one final poll question in just a second about whether you'd be happy to be contacted after this session. There's absolutely no obligation. Can we switch to that poll question now, please? And we'll leave it up while I discuss sort of concluding remarks. So regardless of the answer that you put on this, there's absolutely no obligation. Obviously, it's absolutely fine. A small plug from us as well, do feel free to Google BDO SARs. The first link that you see will be our SAR hub page. It's intended to be a bit of a one-stop shop for various information relating to SARs all in one place. There's also a couple of handy downloadables on there which have content which hopefully you'll find useful and complementary to today's session. And finally, I'd like to firstly thank our panel, so Angela, EJ and Will, for all of their time and their insights that they've shared today. It's really been a useful session to get various perspectives. And also thank you to the audience for taking the time to join us and for participating in all our polls. We hope that you found it useful.